What can a comic artist learn from art history? The first time I posed that question to myself, it was actually in another form. I was asking myself, what can a graphic designer learn from art history? The reason why is because I was working in graphic design and advertising at the time. I had recently graduated from college. I had gone hunting for a job in my field, struggled to get one, and found myself doing graphic design work at a local advertising agency. I was very intimidated at the time that I was hired by the idea of doing creative work 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week. I was afraid that I would run out of things to produce by doing it with that level of frequency and for that long of a time. And it turns out that was a pretty well justified fear, because that is exactly what happened to me. After about 6 months of working that way, I was pretty much burnt out. I had nothing left internally that I could pull from. I had used every idea that I knew of, and it felt at that point like I was just retreading the same ground over and over, and I was producing mediocre work well below the quality of what I felt I should be producing, or even what I had produced in the past, as weak as it was given my age and experience. Now, looking back, I view that burnout as the consequence of a rather poor understanding of art and of creativity generally. I thought of it very much as most people do, which is this innate talent. You either have it or you don't. And when you create things, those things are a product of something internal. You're expressing something internal and then making it external. This is a particularly bad way of thinking when you consider that if you then reach creative burnout, which is going to happen to pretty much everyone at some point, a belief that this is an intrinsic talent that you have and that everything you create comes from within yourself, it will lead you to think that burnout is proving that you never had those things to begin with. Everything you've done at this point is a fluke, if there's been any success at all. And that is exactly what I thought. That was frightening for me because I was newly married. My wife was pregnant with our first child, and I thought I had used up all the market value I had in 6 months. This leads you to become desperate, and when you become desperate, you will embrace possible solutions that previously you didn't really consider to be viable or helpful or necessary. And one of the things that I delved into was art history. Art history very quickly became the saving grace of my creative life. And not only did it reinstill in me a passion for art, but it far exceeded the passion that I previously held. Over the years as well, it reshaped the way in which I thought about art, because the pressure that I was putting on myself, which I see many young artists do, is to essentially invent the entire world of aesthetics from scratch. Whereas art history is this incredibly valuable map that shows you all of the things people have done in the past to great success, and even some of the failures. And you can look across cultures and across time, and you can find the constants of aesthetics that remain. You can also mine it for different techniques and methodologies, things well outside of the knowledge that you have from your own culture. And then you can pull in from other sources new ways of approaching things that you never would have considered. Because in reality, the notion of an intrinsic talent that you simply have or you don't, and then the outpouring of work from within yourself, is not really a truthful way of thinking about art. What we do is we pull in from sources, and then we mix and we match from all these disparate voices. And then we produce something that combines those things in a way that is novel to the moment, that is unique to the moment. It's a new piece of art only in that it's a conglomeration of many different elements that never would have otherwise met. So art history becomes this encyclopedia of ideas, and it utterly and fundamentally changed my life and my work by studying it. And that's a pretty simple thing. And this all sounds, I'm sure, very fine and good from this theoretical and extremely nebulous perspective. But how do you actually do it? And this is something that took me a bit longer to learn, and it took quite a bit more study on how to analyze something and how to use it to the advantage. And I'll give you a couple of things to be aware of right out of the gate. The first one being that it doesn't have to be an extremely practical or obvious solution to a problem that you currently have. A lot of times the solutions to problems come from unexpected sources. It comes from a piece of knowledge or a piece of information that you have gleaned that at the moment didn't really seem like it had practical utility. It didn't look like you could use this as a tool. And so when it comes to art history, you shouldn't come at it with just a totally practical perspective. You should investigate the thing as a whole, not knowing what is going to prove useful to you and not. And this can be frustrating, but it's also just part of the reality. The second thing is that you should make an attempt to enjoy it. As odd of a thing as that sounds, you should investigate things in order to find their triumphs. I do think that people learn better from aspiring to something than criticizing something and just trying to avoid the mistakes. Oftentimes, aspiring to something will take you well past the errors and into the successes. And so this isn't just some kind of banal flattery that only looks at the good sides of something. Exploring the victories, the triumphs, the successes, the excellence of a piece of art history, I think is actually the better way to go. It's what we aspire to that lifts us higher. Negative criticism is certainly useful, but it's not the place where I think any of us should spend most of our time. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a painting, and I'm going to delve into it with analysis, looking at theoretical things, looking at stuff that seems like it might not apply, and some more practical compositional things. But this isn't going to be technical. I'm not going to throw out a lot of terminology. I'm not going to throw out a lot of historical information except for things that are kind of necessary just to understand the image. This is simple exploration, observation, and close examination of a work, thinking deeply about it. And that's really all that it is. This does not require someone to have a vast knowledge of art to delve in and just begin enjoying something. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the Calling of St. Matthew, which is a painting that was completed around 1599 or 1600, depending on who you ask, by Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, who I will refer to as Caravaggio, because I am from Tennessee and it makes it a lot easier. This painting is one of 3 that Caravaggio did for the Matthew cycle that is now hanging together in a chapel, in a church, in Rome. The 3 paintings are the Calling of St. Matthew, the Inspiration of St. Matthew, where he pens his gospel, and then the Martyrdom of St. Matthew, when he is martyred. We're not really going to talk that much about the latter 2. I'll just reference them a couple of times. We're going to be focused in on just looking closely at the calling. By the way, art historical analyses are pretty much my favorite thing to do that isn't drawing. If you also enjoy it, give the video a like, subscribe, share it with somebody, put a comment down below. Let me know that you enjoy this kind of thing. Still new to this, still trying to figure out what my audience wants to see, so weigh in for me. And now let's go to the painting. The Calling of St. Matthew depicts a scene from the Gospels wherein Jesus appears and he calls to Matthew the tax collector. Matthew, in the story, he rises from the table and he follows Christ. What we're seeing here is the moment of the call. And the composition that Caravaggio gives us is really very simple. There are 7 figures. 2 of them are standing on the right, and then there are 5 seated at the table on the left. Of those 5, it's broken up into 2 basic groups. You have 3 of them that are reacting to the figures who have come in and made the call. And then you have two on the far end of the table who are rather wrapped up in their work and they don't really notice what's happening around them. Caravaggio has a tendency to set up his groups of people as though we have happened upon them in real life. In this case, for example, all of the figures are at roughly the same level of height. Again, just like seeing them on a stage during a play. They overlap with each other and are kind of densely packed. This really does give the feeling that I've walked up onto the scene and I'm watching this event play out with my own eyes. Caravaggio is also really well known for his very deliberate use of darkness. In this case, many of the figures are hard to see, and Caravaggio has this tendency to place little dots of light, little areas of light that pull our eye around the frame but don't necessarily give us an area of clear dominance or importance. In fact, the light can very frequently end up misleading us to the areas of the painting that are not as important as others. The window at the top is an obvious example here, where much of the light pulls our eye upwards to something that has nothing to do with the scene at hand. And then on the figures themselves, we get little spots of light in areas that don't necessarily help progress our understanding of the story. For example, on the figure's sleeve and leg, who's sitting closest to the two callers. And then a few spots of light on the hands of figures as they count money. And of course, a little bit of light coming in from the right and splashing over the back of the second figure whose back is to us, of the two figures on the right. Probably the area that has the greatest dominance that also involves figures are the two figures that are facing towards us, seated at the table, both of them reacting to the call that's coming in from the right. However, the two figures aren't giving us a clear indication of what is happening. They seem to be confused. One of them is pointing either to his own chest or to the man next to him, and the other looks intrigued but largely indifferent. This is another thing I have noted in the works of Caravaggio. He tends to focus on the reactions of characters rather than the action itself that's causing them to react. There's this method in play of drawing my attention to the reaction, and then, out of curiosity, I start to look for the cause. What is it that made them react? In this case, my eye is going to be pulled over by their eye line towards these two figures entering from the right, which are largely veiled in shadow. The one behind is the one that's obviously the figure of Christ. You can identify him by the halo over the top of his head, indicating him as the most holy person within the frame, which accords nicely with the iconography of the period. Now, this is a very subtle halo. If you go back into late antiquity, into the medieval period, or the early Renaissance, you're going to see the nimbus, which is much more obvious and gold and clearly defined. But what Caravaggio is giving us is something similar to what you see from other painters at the time, which is a very, very subtle halo, which looks to me even just like a glass disc with a bit of light hitting the edge. This subtlety suits very well what Caravaggio seems to be trying to do, which is to hide Christ, who's making the call. In fact, Christ's indication towards Matthew doesn't really seem to be an intense call. It looks to be very quiet. We can see his hand raised in a gentle gesture, and the mouth is partly open, but there's nothing particularly boisterous about this call. This isn't the kind of thing that interrupts your work entirely. You have to be paying attention to notice if you're one of the men seated at this table. You know, Caravaggio said that he had no teacher but nature, and certainly the intense realism of the scene is something that helps to pull in the viewer and make it feel as though that, again, you're witnessing this with your own eyes. His attention to detail is so extreme that even the stool that one figure is seated upon, we see show up again in the next painting in the series, the Inspiration of St. Matthew, because this was literally a stool that Caravaggio owned in his workshop. We see throughout his body of work many of the objects that he owns showing up in multiple paintings because he was so attentive to the detail, replicating what he saw in the real world. However, that hand of Christ has a little something extra to it. In fact, when I went in and looked at it, you may have even recognized it. See, Michelangelo da Caravaggio was pulling from the work of another Michelangelo, who painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and so you may have recognized that hand from the extraordinarily famous Creation of Adam fresco. It's intriguing to note that between the two options of the hand of God and the hand of Adam, that Caravaggio chose the hand of Adam, even though it meant he had to flip it the opposite direction. This actually makes perfect sense theologically because you see Christ referred to as the new Adam in the New Testament, and so there's an element of symbolism and iconography here. I bring it up because you don't need to know it. One of the things for me that helps to distinguish between good art and we'll say poor art instead of bad, because I don't want to be uncharitable in my critique, but I noticed a long time ago that symbolism became kind of a haven for poorly devised art. When a work of art requires you to understand all of the symbols in order to receive anything of value from the work, then there's a misalignment of priorities. What I love about that little element by Caravaggio is you don't need it at all, but yet it's another layer of symbolism that, if you know it, adds to the richness of the piece. But if I look at the piece by itself and I don't know that piece of information, I lack nothing in understanding the narrative that's playing out in front of me, that Christ is making a call, and that call is subtle and quiet, and then the figures responding, which we'll get to in a minute. This is a lesson that I have pulled from works of great art, which is to not let symbolism be the primary structure that holds up the value of my work. Rather, let more universally comprehensible elements take that role. Let narrative do it, let human experience, let common emotion take that role, and then allow the symbolism to add an additional layer of meaning that is not necessary to understand the core. Now, as for the figures who are reacting, it's probably worth noting that we really don't have any idea who Matthew is here. That might come as something of a surprise, but truthfully, it's not clear which one of these figures is intended to be Matthew. The one who has primarily gotten the honor of being called Matthew is the one in the center, who's pointing his finger either towards his chest or towards the man next to him. It's really not clear which. But there is a complexity here. In the other two paintings we have in this same series that were painted after this one, Matthew really doesn't look like that. He's got a completely different shaped nose and really just doesn't seem to be the same man. So either that's not intended to be the case, or Caravaggio just used a different model for Matthew in later paintings without really caring about the continuity, despite the fact they would be side by side. There's also the complexity that he seems to be paying taxes rather than collecting them, if you look closely at his hand in the scene. However, the man who is counting, the young man with dark hair, bowed over, clutching a money bag in his hand, is the other popular option for Matthew. But we really can't see enough of him to really know whether or not he matches the figures in the later paintings. And also, I'm not entirely sure we're meant to know. As I've already talked about, Caravaggio really wanted us to search and to experience even the confusion of this scene as though we had walked upon it ourselves. The fact that we can't really tell who Christ is gesturing to might, in fact, be part of the point. The subtlety of this call speaks to a concept that I think all of us fear in one way or another, and stands in our lives as a very real threat. The most significant moment of your life could come in so quiet a form, you could miss it entirely. That's a concerning thing to consider, and it might be that that's exactly what Caravaggio is inviting us to do. We don't really know who Matthew is, but regardless of who he is, he seems to have missed or misinterpreted this first call. Either as the young man with the money bags, he's missed it entirely, or like the man who's pointing possibly at his own chest, he's not really willing or sure enough to believe that it's him that needs to rise to the moment. There's something deeply human in all of that, and the reality that the most important call that could ever be made to us, the moment upon which our life hinges, could come in the form of a still, small voice, unobtrusive and very easily missed. When I look at a work like this, which is one of my favorite paintings. I'm inspired by the way in which the methods, the style, and the execution play into a meaning, a narrative, a purpose for the work. There's such self-discipline to the way in which this is used. Realism in of itself is frequently held up as being valuable simply because of the skill that it takes to accomplish. And I wouldn't discount that entirely. But realism in its best form is going to be used for its strengths to help the viewer, to help the audience, to see in the work a deeper meaning than what they would have had otherwise. The Calling of St. Matthew is a beautiful painting, but it's also a painting that demonstrates skill and a depth of the work that I aspire to. What can a comic artist learn from art history? First of all, is to not think of comic art as all that different from the other forms of art that have existed throughout history. They overlap way too much for that to be a sensible distinction to make. There are definitely elements that are unique to each medium. There's elements that are unique to each purpose of a piece of artwork that's created. But a person who studies only the medium in which they work, only the time in which they live, will miss the opportunities to inject true innovation into their medium. Mixing from unexpected sources is the best way to come up with a new approach to something that has been done many times. Art history is a fountain of options. I have shown one painting from a period and from an artist that I particularly enjoy. There are endless options that you can explore. You can use things like Google Arts and Culture to find options. You can visit museum websites. You can buy books on art history, which is the thing that I recommend. They're surprisingly cheap at used bookstores. It's almost like people don't really appreciate art history textbooks. But I admit, I have an ulterior motive for this video and for wanting every artist to engage with art history. I genuinely believe it has made me a better artist, and that is not unique to me, but rather a path that will help every artist who engages with it enthusiastically, who finds a love for it, who finds an interest and a curiosity about it. You can pick from so many different periods and find so many different ways of studying. But I do have another motive. Just like in reading literature, just like in reading poetry, just like in spending time in nature, this will enrich your life. It has extraordinarily enriched mine. Greater satisfaction, fulfillment, enjoyment, a higher level of appreciating things has come from my study of art history, and I would wish that on everyone. I frequently tell my students that I am concerned about their employability, as I should be. But I am far more concerned about the 6 to 8 decades of life that they will live and what the quality of that life will be after they have left my classroom. Engaging with old things, engaging with history and culture is a path towards a greater sense of satisfaction and a greater richness of life. And when we ignore that, we are squandering one of the easiest opportunities to live better. And that's everything I've got. If you have thoughts, if you have things about the Calling of St. Matthew, let me know below. If you have other pieces of artwork that you'd like to see analyzed, let me know below. I love the research. I love the staring at it. I love the observation that goes into analyzing a work of art. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll come back and watch one later. You can go watch lots of other things on my channel as well, and I will see you around the time of the next video.